In this episode, we will build the trigger component, which will take care of the selected checkboxes. Basically, if we select whatever, how many, when we click that button, what should happen with the input. Okay, let's go back to the editor. Under the triggers, let's create a new view component. We'll call it multi-checkbox trigger. So multi-checkbox trigger. And inside of this component, we're removing a template because we will use our trigger that we've refactored in the previous video as a mixin. So import trigger from, and we go in the same directory trigger. Let's add it as a mixin. So mixins trigger. We will also make use of the Ajax color. So import Ajax color from, and we go in 2 levels up, mixins and Ajax color. Let's add it to our mixins as well. So Ajax color, and the last mixin we're going to use, I'm just going to duplicate this line and replace the name with multi-handler. And that's also as a mixin, so multi-handler. Now for the properties, we are going to have behavior, because we want to know what's going to happen once we receive the response from the server. And the type will be string, and the required flag will be set to false, because sometimes we may come across the situation when we would like to get the behavior based on the submitted input. And in that case, the behavior will be returned with the response. So that's why, to start with, we're going to set it to false for the required. So in other words, you will not be required to provide the value for this property. Then we're going to have a listen property. Now listen property, if we open our form, inputs, checkbox, and we have our master checkbox, you'll see this one is another component that makes use of this multi-handler. And if we open multi-handler, you'll see that we register custom listeners, and we actually using the property listen, but we didn't declare this property on the component itself, which means that it needs to come from the component that actually makes use of this multi-handler. And in case of our master checkbox, that comes from a base input, because base input has this property declared. So now if we go back to our multi-checkbox trigger, we obviously would have to add it manually. So let's add it as type string, and required set to false. Now, because it's false, what we should do from multi-handler is to first check if this property actually has any value. So we check if, actually let's do the opposite. Let's check if it doesn't have a listen, or if listen doesn't have any value associated with it, then simply return and don't register this listener. And that same applies obviously to the input. If we go back to our master checkbox and check base input, you'll see this listen property is also optional. So let's go back to our multi-checkbox trigger. Now, the next thing we're going to do is start with the computed properties. We don't have any data within this particular component, so compute it. And what we need is, for our Ajax color, we need this request data. So let's just copy this property, and from here we are going to return an object with items index, and this will return the items from within the multi-handler, the property that we have within the multi-handler component. So this items, all collected items. Now from within the methods, we have the evaluate one. If we go back to the multi-handler, we have this evaluate step here. When the event is being triggered, then what do we need to do after we've actually removed or added items to the collection? So the evaluate method, evaluate, and this method will simply set this is disabled flag to either false or true based on whether we have any items. So this items length triple equal 0. Then next method will be trigger. So when we click on the button, this method will be called, and this method will simply make Ajax call. So this make Ajax call, and we pass in this call successful, and otherwise this call failed. Let's now add both of these methods. So we'll start with call successful. So call successful, and we'll take response. And then for the call failed, we will receive an error. Okay, with call successful, we are going to try and then catch an error. And if we catch an error, what we want to do is use error handler show error, and what we're going to pass through as an object will be message saying invalid form behavior, and then let's just put the name of the behavior. So response data behavior, there we go, and we concatenate it with double quotes and a single quote in between, and let's put the full stop there as well. Okay, so that's the message we're going to show, and then we also need to stop processing Ajax call to make sure that if we have any buttons, obviously with the spinning icon, anything like this, these change back to what they were originally. And from within the try statement, we are going to use a new class behavior. We don't have this class yet. This is not the same class that we used for the form. It's a different one. And on this behavior, we're going to try and call the behavior method. So this behavior, which is associated with the property, but only if this one exists. So if it exists, let's use it. Behavior, otherwise use the behavior received from the response. So response data behavior. And if that method exists, then call it with passing instance of itself as the first argument and then response as the second. Now, if it won't find the method with the name associated with the behavior, then the error is going to be thrown, and obviously this is when we're going to catch it. Okay, so that's our unsuccessful method. Let's now move to the call failed. From call failed, we're simply going to use error handler as well, and we call show error with the error as the first argument, and then we are going to also provide a callback. What we want to do before we actually show this error, let's stop processing Ajax call. And before we do anything else, let's import this class. Actually, let's create the class container. So that's going to be JavaScript, just behavior. Let's create this and export the default class behavior. And for now, we're just going to leave it like this. And let's import it here. So import behavior from the same directory, behavior. And that's now available here. Okay, another thing is when we click the button, we want to disable it as well, and any associated buttons, any buttons that belong to the same group. So we don't click one button, then another button to execute two different callbacks. So we're going to start with start processing Ajax call event, which is available to us from within the Ajax caller. There's another method that we can attach to the call when we actually calling this make Ajax call. And from here, what I'm going to do is use event bus, and we're going to call method fire to fire an event, disable started hyphen and concatenated with the group name. So plus this group. And when we finish, then stop processing Ajax call event. Here we're going to fire the event bus, fire, disable, end it, and again concatenate with the group name, so we know which group we're referring to. Okay, and that's that. In the next video, let's have a look at this behavior. So we have all these behaviors ready for when we actually trying to use this component. One other thing we're going to actually do before we finish this video, we're going to do the check in the trigger, because some of the triggers may not need Ajax calls. Some of them will just take the input and redirect you to another page. Like for instance, if you want to export some data, we don't really need to make an Ajax call and then wait for the response. We just take the input and redirect the user to the other page. So we're going to check if behavior, and there's going to be a method which we don't have yet, is non-Ajax, and we pass this behavior as an argument. It's UR, is it? Or have I used? Yes. If behavior is non-Ajax, then what we want to do is simply call this behavior and then method straight away on it. In this case, obviously, we're not going to receive behavior from the response, so it will have to be associated with the behavior property. So behavior, so that method, and again, the same thing, this, and this time we're going to pass just items rather than response, this items. And then we hit return so that this make Ajax call never gets executed in this case. Okay, so let's save and we can close this file because that's everything from within our multi-checkbox trigger. And in the next video, we'll have a look at the behavior class.